Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier. This is our second of our series looking at the American Civil War. And the topic today is on the very first major land battle of the American Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. So as we think about our topic today, these are the page readings that we'll be looking at. We're looking at pages 516 to 518. We're looking at kind of three questions. Who won the First Battle of Bull Run? How did this impact Northern attitudes? What was the rebel yell? What was the decision that General Robert E. Lee had to make? And what was his final decision? So let's talk here about the first land battle. As we mentioned in our previous lecture, we said that both sides figured that this would not be a very long-lasting conflict. Both felt very confident that their side would prevail and win in very decisive action as the war broke out. Now, this has been several weeks after the attack on Fort Sumter. We are now getting into June, and there is pressure on the North, especially on Lincoln, to start to carry out some sort of action to start leading the attack towards the capital of the Confederacy down in Richmond. And so by the time we get into the summer months of 1861, the North is ready to start looking at marching on to Richmond under this immense pressure that was building up. The North was not ready for the conflict. Really, neither side was ready for this conflict, but especially the North wasn't really fully prepared for this conflict. So here we have a map here that shows Washington, D.C., the capital of the Union, and we have this major road intersection coming down through here towards the city of Richmond. And we have a creek here called Bull Run Creek. And this is where we are going to have our first major conflict just a few miles outside of Washington, D.C., at a place called the Battle of Bull Run, or also known as the Battle of Manassas. Now, you will find that for a lot of the battles of the American Civil War, there actually are two names for the battles. There will be a name that will be assigned to it from the North, and a name that will be assigned to it from the South. Traditionally, the North will name the battles after the nearest body of water. So this battle takes place near Bull Run Creek, which runs right through here, hence the name the Battle of Bull Run. The South traditionally named their battles after the nearest settlement or town that the battle was fought near. And in this case, it was fought near the town of Manassas, Virginia, hence the name the Battle of Manassas. Now, this particular area will see battles twice, so this will be the first Battle of Bull Run. There'll be a secondary battle called the Second Battle of Bull Run that will take place, down the road, later on down the road. So what happened here at the first Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of First Manassas? Well, this takes place in July 21st, 1861, near the town of Manassas, Virginia. This will be the really first major land battle of the American Civil War. You can see from the graphic that's in the picture here that shows the Battle of Bull Run. Here you have the landscape, the hills, side, fighting here, and you will see tremendous amount of confusion. If you look at the uniforms of the soldiers, you will see soldiers that some will be wearing blue, you'll see some that are wearing red, you'll see some that are wearing gray, and you'll see this red, white, and blue flag kind of out there in the background that looks awfully like this flag as well. The first Battle of Bull Run was a very confused mess. The two armies had not really settled on official uniform colors. You had many Southerners who were still wearing their blue uniforms that they had when they served in the Union the U.S. Army. You had some Northern militia units, which are kind of like our National Guard, that were wearing gray uniforms. You had some Southern units wearing gray uniforms. Some units were wearing green uniforms. And the national flag of the U.S., which we refer to as our Stars and Stripes, looks very much like in the distance the Confederate national flag, which is known as the Stars and Bars, which has three major bars, two red, one solid bar of white, and another blue view of the stars that show the stars of the Confederate States. So both sides were greatly confused in this conflict. You had both sides not really knowing necessarily who was on whose side at all times during the conflict. Now, when the war battle first began, it actually came out to be a pretty good Union start. They ended up having some pretty major pushback from the Confederate defenses that were there surrounding the town of Manassas. But eventually, the reinforcements will show up from the Confederacy that will begin to push back the Northern advances, and the North lines will just completely collapse. The North was made up of mostly untested troops and soldiers. They had not seen combat before, and once things started to go against them, they kind of panicked and freaked out. And the South was able to hold the ground and then counterattack and push them off the field. The South would employ, which was used in many of these battles, a very famous phrase, the rebel yell. It was a blood-curdling scream that was used by Confederate troops. Kind of gave them a psychological edge. You would see this horde of soldiers running down at you with guns that had knives affixed to the end of them. We call those bayonets, screaming the blood-curdling scream. Some Union soldiers refer to as if there was the hell's demons had been unleashed upon them. I mean, it was kind of a frightful scene and situation, and the soldiers sometimes panicked. And especially here at the Battle of Bull Run, these very untested soldiers will also tremendously panic as well. To make matters worse, since this battle was fought so close to Washington, D.C., many of the civilian population of the surrounding area came to actually watch the battlefield and set up picnics from the surrounding hillsides that watched the battle unfold. Again, many Northerners and Southerners felt that this was going to not last very long, and they wanted to actually see a real live battle. So they kind of went to like a football, like we go to a football game today. They tailgated, they set up camp, they set up their tailgate, and they sat and watched this battle unfold. The only downside, though, was once the Union Army was forced to retreat off the battlefield, the civilians become part of the conflict as well, and they are also forced to retreat, clogging all the roads back to Washington, D.C. So it was complete and utter chaos. So why is this an important battle? Well, it was an important battle because it definitely illustrated some very poor Union leadership that also showed that this is not going to be an easy win for the North. They're not just going to be able to march directly on to Richmond and end the conflict right then and there. This war could drag on for a little while. So even though the North went in very overconfident in this campaign, it'll see that this is not going to end very, very quickly. Another important consequence of this battle is involving a particular general, and his name is General Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a very major up-and-coming officer before the Civil War broke out. And in fact, he was looking like a rising star in the U.S. Army. But when the Civil War broke out and Virginia was forced to make a decision to secede and join the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, a Virginian, had a very difficult decision to make. Did he stay in the U.S. Army that he had been a part of for most of his adult life, that was giving him promotions, and in fact, Abraham Lincoln himself was looking at appointing Lee as the supreme commander of U.S. military forces, or does Lee resign his commission as an officer in the Army and join his family members that are seceding from the country? And he has a very fateful decision that he has to make. At the end of the day, Lee decides to join Virginia, but he does not initially join the military of the Confederacy. After the Battle of Bull Run, though, he begins to be picked by the Confederacy, and he will then be appointed as the supreme commander of the Confederate forces, or the Army of Virginia, as they were known as. You will find out in the coming lectures that it's his leadership that really keeps the Confederate Army together and holds the South into this fight with the North. Even though the North has all these advantages we talked about, more factories, more soldiers, but not really great leadership, the South uses the leadership of Robert E. Lee in a lot of ways to keep the South into this fight, and as you'll find out, most of his battles will be won decisively from his leadership. So as we think about this very first battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of First Manassas, as it's also known as, was thought to be going to be an easy, quick victory for the North. Turns out to be a complete debacle, a huge mess. And it's not going to be an easy victory as once thought. So that ends our video lecture. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to Mr. Mosher.